what is the IELTS test? The IELTS test is an examination meant for non-native English speakers to test their ability to use English. There's a speaking part, a listening part, a writing part, and a reading part. So 4 different parts. Now within each part there are parts. So there are 3 questions, for example, in the speaking part. We're going to talk about one of the questions in the speaking part of the IELTS exam. Now, if you are not a person who is interested in the IELTS, should you just ignore this? Well, actually, practicing IELTS questions is a great way to work on your ability to organize your thoughts in English. It really is. If you know how to answer an IELTS question well, you should be able to, in a conversation, explain something very clearly. It can help you to learn how to organize your thoughts in English, think in English, and express yourself. So even if you're not taking the IELTS test, you should pay attention. This can really, really help. It's a great exercise. And I often, with my personal students, will use IELTS questions even if they're not preparing for the exam. Okay, now we're going to talk about the second question in the IELTS test, which is often considered the most difficult because it has several parts. But actually, those parts make it, in a way, easier, but we have to know how to approach it, how to begin to answer it, how to think about it in the right way. Okay, so really the question is, how do we answer an IELTS question? And we have some strategies, some tips that we need. We have to know some things, okay? So let's just go through these, and then we'll actually practice it. Then we'll actually talk about how to answer it with a real question. All right, so first we have to think about the structure of the question. Usually, a Part 2 question has several parts, okay? And so we can use those parts as the outline itself. That can make it a lot easier to organize. A lot of people will think, okay, I have a question here, and I need to figure out an outline by myself, and then I need to answer it. But when you're answering a Part 2 question, you only have a very short period of time to prepare, and then you have to speak for 2 minutes about the question. So you often don't have time to make an outline. You barely have time to decide what you're going to talk about. The best thing to do is to actually use the question as an outline because it has several parts. And we'll look at that in just a second. Okay? Now, the other one is there's the time limit. You have to speak for 2 minutes. Now, as long as you speak for 2 minutes, you're okay. If you finish after 1 minute, then you're not okay. If you talk for a minute and say, I'm done, that's not so good. But if they stop you and you're not quite done, it's probably okay. Maybe you're telling a story, you're not quite finished, it's probably okay. Now, you don't want to be still talking about the very first thing in your answer, but as long as you're moving through the points and you're sharing your explanation of whatever the question is about, whatever it may be, then you should be okay. So don't stress out about the time limit. Often the time limit is what makes people feel nervous. 2 minutes. Right? Don't let it make you feel nervous. Just answer as you would answer. And again, we're going to do an example in just a second, okay? Now, we also need to think about how to answer the question correctly. One of the things that I think makes people do worse on the speaking part is to try to use all kinds of difficult words or sentence structures that you don't actually know that well. Now, if you're able to use those, if you're able to use a really complex sentence structure or something like that, or a very difficult vocabulary word, and you do it correctly, great, that will probably help your score, right? However, if you use it wrong, then it hurts your score quite a bit. So it would be much better if you use simple English correctly rather than using complicated English incorrectly, okay? So keep it simple and use what you know rather than trying to use something that you really don't know that well. It's better to use simple English correctly than very complex English incorrectly. The other thing is that when you're sharing details, remember that the examiner doesn't know what's going on in your head. So if you make up something, if something isn't true, if something is just a detail because you need it to tell the story and it's not true about your life, fine. They're not living in your head, and they're not giving you a lie detector test, okay? So don't worry too much about that. If you have to make up a detail, sometimes the questions are, tell me about the most thing in your whole life. And then you stress out about, which one is the most? I have number 1, number 2, and number 3. I don't know which one is number 1. Don't stress out about that, okay? Pick one. The examiner isn't going to say, hey, wait a second, that wasn't number 1, that was number 2. No. Just pick one, okay? They don't know which thing is your favorite thing or your second favorite thing. They don't really know. So just pick one because you have to pick quickly. You have to choose quickly. You don't have time to think, okay? That's really, really important to keep in mind. Okay, the other one, in the last thing we need to keep in mind is that we should try to get the simple details out of the way. Often there's a chance to use simple details first. Once we finish saying those things, then we can focus on telling the story. So often we get caught up in trying to get the story and the simple details together, kind of mixed to make sure we cover all the points. The best thing to do is get the simple details out of the way. Usually that's point number 1, 2, and 3, and then focus the rest of our time on just telling the story. And then we can relax and just use our memory and describe what's in our memory, okay? So that's it. That's what you have to keep in mind. Why don't we do one? Why don't we actually practice this, okay? So let's look at a question from part 2. Okay. Now, you can go online, you can look at a bunch of IELTS questions. If you want to practice this, you should. You should look up IELTS questions and practice this, even if you're not taking the IELTS test, because they are a great way to improve your spoken English and, as I said, improve your ability to organize your thoughts in English. So the question is, describe a memorable trip you've taken. You should say where you were going, who you went with, why you decided to go, and what made it a memorable trip. Now, look at the first 3. Where, who, and why. Those are pretty simple details, right? So we can get that stuff out of the way right at the beginning. Where, who, and why. And then we can focus on what made it a memorable trip. Now, you have a chance to write some things down, so you might write down on a piece of paper where, who, why, and then just tell the story. Okay, so why don't we actually try this? So I'm going to decide very quickly. Let's see. I'm going to talk about my trip to South Africa, and I'm going to say I went with my wife because that's true. And then I'm going to say that I went because I wanted to get to know my girlfriend at the time better and really get to know her to see if maybe we were a really good fit or not. And then I'm going to talk about some of the memories from the trip, okay? Now, I'm not going to focus too much on the time limit right now because I don't have a timer. We won't stress about that. But I'm going to just quickly answer the question as I would answer it, okay? You guys can give me a score if you want. I've never answered this question before, so I'm just organically answering it. And I don't have my notes, but I'll remember where, who, and why. And I'll also say the time. So, about 5 years ago, I took a trip to South Africa with my wife. Although she wasn't my wife at the time, she was my girlfriend. And we really went, at least the reason I went, to get to know each other, to see if we were really compatible, to see if we were a good fit. Because before we had only dated and seen each other once or twice a week, we wanted to see if we could really spend time together. So we went to South Africa for a whole month, and we traveled to a couple other countries as well. Now, a lot of really interesting things happened during the trip. The most important thing, though, is that we did find that we were very compatible. We really did get to know each other. We had a lot of crazy adventures. And I'd just like to talk about a few that made the trip really, really memorable. We decided from the beginning, because we both love animals, that we wanted to volunteer. South Africa, and all of Africa, is quite famous for animal conservation. So we volunteered at a baboon rehabilitation center. And I forget the name of it, but basically they take baboons whose mothers have been killed by farmers and they rehabilitate them. And the volunteers feed them, cut fruit for them, give them medicine, clean their cages, all of that sort of thing. And it was tough. It was very, very difficult. And we had to live in a cabin, and our cabin was raided. It was broken into by some local villagers, and they stole a bunch of our stuff. And through that experience, that struggle, that difficulty, we bonded. My then girlfriend and I, we bonded. We came together and got through the struggle. And I think that allowed me to see, wow, this person is not only a cool person, but also tough, resilient. We also had a lot of great memories after we finished the volunteer work. We went to the city, we drank a lot of red wine. We found we had a lot of interests in common, like red wine, jewelry. We went around and shopped for some interesting local jewelry, and nature. We went on a lot of little tours and trips around South Africa to see nature. We found we had many things in common and that we were actually a really good fit for each other. So that trip for me was very, very memorable. Okay, so that's my answer. I don't know how long it was because I'm not timing it. I probably could make it a little shorter, but that's basically how you do it, and you practice that. So if you're taking the IELTS, if you're not taking the IELTS, what you can do is search a list of questions and try to answer one a day. Record yourself. See how you do. See if you can organize your thoughts clearly. Use some of the tips we talked about. And again, even if you're not taking the IELTS, your English will improve if you do that every day.